it was established in 1921, and really for the next 25 years, it campaigned under the slogan of work of full maintenance. And work, by the way, they said at trade union rates, not just any old pay. In 1929, the movement actually dropped the word committee from its title, so it was known more simply after that as the National Unemployed Workers Movement. So the point I want to make to begin with is there was a political impetus to this, which came about as a result of the massive, socialist movement during the First World War and afterwards. And this led to the political philosophy behind the movement, the National Unemployed Workers Movement, which was a united front type philosophy. It was not sectarian. It attempted to organise the unemployed and the employed, as we shall see in a moment. There were two phases essentially to this movement. The first was in between 1921 and 24, and the second was in the 30s, particularly from 1931 to 36. At its peak, possibly 1933, the movement had upwards of 100,000 members, but there were periods where the membership declined, particularly in the 20s, after 1924, when the movement seemed close to extinction. The peaks and troughs of the movement, not surprisingly, roughly coincided with levels of unemployment, and the early 20s and the 30s completely were very high periods of unemployment. And in particular in the 20s, it was the staple industries and the men, as I said before, but in the 30s, unemployment hit everywhere. I won't go into the reasons for that because I don't think I've got time, it's a shame. But the movement itself was responsible for using very daring and innovative methods of protest, not just including hunger marches, which is what everybody seems to know about, well, at least they know of it or they associate it. It was very important, hunger marches, but there were also factory raids to protest against overtime working. There were mass demonstrations often aimed at particular poor law guardians. The Poor Law, by the way, which was introduced in 1834, the Poor Law Amendment Act, said that poor people or people who were very poor could either go into a workhouse but not to have out or starve. There was no outdoor relief. This was slightly modified later on, particularly by the 1911 Insurance Act. But again, I'm not going to go into that into detail. But the poor relief was overseen by what were called boards of poor law guardians, who were, and there were protests, mass protests and demonstrations often aimed at poor law guardians who were still responsible for the administration of poor relief under the archaic provisions of the 1834 Act. But also, and this is interesting, I think, that in the 20s particularly, but also in the 30s, the movement, the unemployed workers movement, showed solidarity with workers taking action. For example, the engineers' lockout of 1922, which followed the defeat of the miners in Black Friday of 1921. In 1922, between 1922 and 23, the first hunger march was organised. It was an amazing event with workers from all over the country converging on London. The membership of that time, in that very early days, was about 100,000 of movement, about 300 local committees. I want to stress one point, and that is that women played a very, very prominent role in the movement right from the beginning. A woman called Lillian Thring was the editor of the NUWM paper, newspaper called Out of Work. It was an amazing paper, and it had a circulation in its heyday, which was about 1923, of about 60,000. From the outset, a place was reserved on the National Administrative Council of the movement for a woman's organiser. And this was first held by Lillian Thring, and later, from 1929, by a woman called Maud Brown. when a women's department was also established. I think it's very interesting because one of the things that the movement recognised was that poverty, well, they didn't use this term, but in essence what they were talking about was the feminisation of poverty, that women bore the brunt because they bore the brunt of childcare and providing food for the family. They bore the brunt of poverty, and that was unrecognised because they didn't get national insurance. They couldn't apply for poor relief, but the notion was somehow or other fed into society that a wage that was the wage was the so-called family wage given to the man in the family to support his wife and dependent children. Of course, it was nonsense, complete nonsense, as we know, and it still is nonsense, by the way. Or even though it's what our benefit system today is based on, complete nonsense. So women's contingents were a regular feature of the hunger marches of the 30s, but also of the 20s, actually, of the 1922 march, especially when, owing to the introduction of the means test by, of course, the Labour government, the 1922 to 31 Labour government introduced the means test. Whole families then bore the direct burden of unemployment. I'd like to say more about the Labour government. There were two Labour governments. I don't think I've got time to do that, unfortunately. Both were minority governments, the 1924 government, which did very little for the unemployed, and the 1929-31 government, also a minority government, which introduced the means test and did absolutely nothing for the unemployed at all. And of course, in the end, betrayed the whole movement. Ramsay MacDonald then formed the national government, and so it went on and on. So why was it so well supported? It was well supported, this movement, and I think there's a number of reasons. First of all, it's very innovative campaigning and of a united front support, especially the hunger marches. The other reason, I think, for its success was that when I say success, by the way, of course, it didn't solve the problem of unemployment. What it did was to bring attention to the problem in a way which politicians found it actually quite hard to ignore. And there were changes made slight changes anyway. Nevertheless, one of the other point really is that it drew, and this is why it was one of the reasons why it was successful, it drew the employed to support the unemployed. The line of thinking was, and I'm not going to quote anything at the moment, but the line of thinking was that you might be employed for now, but you don't know when unemployment is going to hit you, because this system, this capitalist system, will dispense with workers whenever they feel fit. And of course that proved to be true, because in the 30s especially, as I said before, it wasn't just the old industries that were being being put out to grass. Many of the new industries in places like Coventry and so on were also suffering bouts of unemployment, because that's how the system works. As we all know today, when it gets tough, what do people do? What does capital do? It tries to dispense with its biggest expense, which is workers. So the other point, I think.
Mary, can I just give you like 2 more minutes?
Oh, right, okay. The other important thing is that it paid meticulous attention both to the general and particular problems of the unemployed. So the fact is that the TUC itself was actually rather hostile to the movement. This is and I wish I had more time, but I haven't. So basically between the period of 1929 and 31, the so-called third period, there was a tendency actually happened in the Communist Party that Social Democrats were known as social fascists. The NUWM never took that position. It carried on broad working. So basically the legacy of this in TUC was extreme hostility to any movement that had communists in it. And that really meant that it had nothing to do with the movement. It was already unofficial, and it was always unofficial, but nevertheless, it did gain support from active trade unions who saw what they were saying was good. And I think there are amazing lessons to be learnt from today. One is a united front strategy. The other is drawing attention of the employed to the unemployed. And thirdly, of course, the only thing that we need to learn fully and properly is that we have to agitate, educate and organise. And we have to dare to struggle and dare to win.